Okay, guys, before we get into this great episode with Ezra Wyrick, I got to talk about a couple of other podcasts that I've been on recently. If you like the Protestant Libertarian podcast, I think you're going to love these other shows. So, in the last month, I have been on the Daniel 3 Biblical Anarchy podcast. It's run by Jacob Winograd, and we had a really incredible conversation about biblical inerrancy and about what it means to be a Protestant. It was just a great show, and if you're interested in some of the conversations surrounding inerrancy that we've had on this show before, you're going to love that episode. I was also fortunate enough to be on the Libertarian Christians podcast, which is put out by LCI, and Doug Stewart is the host for that podcast. It was an incredible show. We talked about a wide range of topics from my background as a Christian and a libertarian, some of my favorite books. We talked about postmodernism for a really long time, so we dove into a ton of really great topics. Also, I had my very first article published over at the Libertarian Christian Institute. I'm going to put links to that in the show notes. The article is about why we don't have to think that Jesus was a modern man in order to support libertarianism. And we deal with the issue that we dealt with in the episode that we did on Henry Cadbury, where we talk about how Jesus can't be fit into modern social and political categories. All of those are excellent podcasts and articles. And I know that if you love the Protestant Libertarian podcast, you will love them. I will put links to them in the show notes today. Let's go ahead and get into our great conversation with Ezra Wyrick on everything today. All right, guys, welcome to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. My guest today, the first time ever I've had a returning guest, Ezra Wyrick is back. The first time I had him on the show, we talked about Murray Rothbard and the way that his philosophy works with a bunch of different aspects, politically and socially. And today we're just going to go through some of the big events that are happening in the news. Ezra, welcome back to the Protestant Libertarian Podcast.
Hey, man, thanks for having me back on. It's an honor.
Hey, this is great. Well, before we start talking about any of these news topics, you had a very important event take place in your life a couple of weeks ago. This is kind of like the Super Bowl of libertarianism. You were able to be on the Tom Woods show. I mean, that's classic. So I just wanted, before we get into our conversation about current events today, just talk to us about like that whole experience. Like, what was it like being on his show and interacting with him?
Yeah, so I recently had the great honor to be on with Tom Woods on the Tom Woods show, and we had a great conversation. We discussed the topic of young people and libertarianism. We briefly went over the intersectionality between libertarianism and Christianity. We talked about the issue of young people and COVID, and the issue of young people as opposed rebellion. And not just rebellion, also the culture of conformity rather than the culture of rebellion. We had a good conversation, and I'm passionate about promoting the ideals of liberty, and I think that young people, it's very important to have those kind of conversations because young people have a very unique role to play in shaping the future of the country, and I think that it's our responsibility as young people to become informed and engaged in the political process, and not just that, to challenge the status quo, right, and to fight for the principles that we believe in. And I think that's very important. So I think those kind of informed conversations are very important to have, particularly for young people.
Yeah, and it's great to be able to do it on a platform as big as Tom Woods. And he asked really great questions and you gave really great answers. I'm going to put a link to that episode in the show notes because I think if you're listening to this, you'll probably be interested in that conversation. But again, why do you think it is that so many young people are, there are very few people that are, you're 18, right?
Yes.
Right. Yeah. So you're a really young guy, and a lot of 18-year-olds are either completely politically apathetic, or they're like they're kind of like thoughtless MAGA Republicans, or they're thoughtless progressives. Why do you think that so many young people are either apathetic or gravitate towards the two political extremes?
Well, I actually discussed that with Tom Woods a little bit. I think that young people in general are just not engaged, and if they are engaged, the political background or the political environment that they grow up with their home life and in their everyday life as a child and then later on as a teenager, I believe that factors into it a lot. Like if you're raised in an extremely conservative household, you will be extremely conservative. Or if you're raised in an extremely left-leaning household, you'll be extremely left-leaning. But if you get engaged, that is. And a lot of young people just don't get engaged. They're like, I don't care. I literally don't care. Like, it is not having any effect whatsoever on my life, so I don't care about politics. And that is something that young people will obviously grow out of. Eventually, they will care once they start realizing that they have to give a large percentage of their income to the government, and that it's kind of a big scam, right? So yeah, I think they will begin to care, but right now, just not a lot of young people that are engaged. And if they are engaged, they're engaged in one extreme or another. I don't think that's a good thing. I think it's something that just has to fix itself.
Yeah. Well, and I think, to the point that you're making right there, it does for a lot of younger people. Like, you mentioned the fact that when some people start paying taxes, like real taxes, that often changes their perspective about government and the role that government plays in their life. And one of the things that I've noticed over the last couple of years is that libertarianism really is it's a very mature and philosophically consistent philosophy. And for me, it took me several years to get there. But we've been dealing with kind of this COVID-19 epidemic and then all of the fallout that came from the government's response to COVID-19. And it seems like that really did wake a lot of people up. Like, and I know that you shared your story before, but there were a lot of people that were in high school and just had their entire high school career ruined, like athletics and academics and all of it, because of the way that the government responded to COVID. And of course, we've been skeptical about that response all along. And like over the last 6 or 7 months, it's like we've just been vindicated on point after point after point. So where do you see COVID kind of fitting into all of this? And how do you see the current state of the COVID conversation in our country right now?
Well, I think a lot of people that previously supported lockdowns and previously supported, the government overreach that happened during COVID are waking up to reality that this was a really bad idea. And I think a lot of people are not just waking up to the reality that it was a really bad idea. I mean, they're still not going to admit that we were right, but they hope to just move on. They hope we're just going to let it slide, to so to speak. Just let it slide. It was only 2 years ago. It was 2 years ago. It's old news, right? So yeah, and that's not going to happen. At least not on my end, and I know not for a lot of other young people and people in general. One of the major effects of the decreased social interaction on young people, something that I'd particularly like to address. You know, the decreased social interaction that was caused by the lockdowns, there's been a significant increase in suicides among young people. 18-year-olds, 19-year-olds jumping out of windows, hanging themselves, all forms of suicide. I think the statistics, particularly on that front, are just unforgivable. And it's heartbreaking to see the devastating toll that the lockdowns took on the mental health of young people. And I just think it's unacceptable. It's unacceptable that the government forced young people to suffer in that way. And I think it's up to people that care about freedom and care about liberty to reflect on that and call for accountability. We have to demand that our government respect the autonomy of individuals. And that did not happen during COVID. We have to demand that the government allows people to make their own decisions about how to live their lives. And another issue, I think, with COVID is that in addition to the devastating effects on young people, which is particularly important to me as a young person, the lockdowns, they also had a horrendous impact on the small business sector. I mean, thousands of businesses were forced to close their doors, and probably millions of people, lost their jobs. It's a tragedy. I think the point here is that it serves as a clear example of the devastating consequences of government overreach. And I think if we look back on these events, they say hindsight is always 2020. And it's important that we learn from this. We have to learn from our mistakes. We have to ensure that these kind of unjust government policies are never repeated. We have to fight back against unjust policies like this. We have to stand up for the rights of all individuals, whether they're old, young, it doesn't matter. I believe that I think if we don't stand up for the rights of all individuals, including young people and small business owners, then why are we standing up for anyone's rights? Because if we can't protect young people, then we are a failed society if we can't protect the liberties of young people. Because young people are our next generation, the people that will be here after we're gone. Well, after some other people are gone. I'm a young person myself, so I don't want to come off like that, but you know what I mean. I think that young people will be here after a lot of other people are gone. And if we can't protect them, then what are we even doing?
Yeah, so you made a really good point there, and I mean, you're absolutely right. Like the government's response to COVID, I think, in a lot of ways, was way worse than the disease itself. And I mean, there were so many people that got screwed over, so many lives that were destroyed. And we're free market economics kind of people, so we understand like the second, third, fourth, fifth order economic consequences of those kinds of government decisions.
Yes.
And I don't think that a lot of people at the popular level did until they had these small businesses that they had been running for years get shut down unfairly. And I think I read a statistic where it's like half of the small businesses in the United States shut down during COVID and they'll never reopen again. But as you said, there's been a reluctance by people that are in the media and politicians and bureaucrats who are responsible for promoting a lot of these policies. There has been definitely a reluctance for them to admit that they were wrong. Do you think though that more and more people are becoming aware of the fact that there was a bunch of propaganda, or do you think that people are just shifting from COVID to whatever the next thing is? Like, do you think that this is going to be a real opportunity to kind of wake the average person up to just how bad some of these government policies are?
I think it did wake a lot of people up, honestly, but I do think that there is that desire to just move on. I mean, you see it among the two parties, right? I mean, there's a desire to just move on. Let's move on from COVID. Let's forget that the lockdowns even happened. So what that half the businesses shut down and millions of people lost their jobs? Let's just move on. The economy was permanently damaged because we printed trillions of dollars, and we did. Who knows? We may never know the true effect on young people, particularly extremely young people, and also teenagers that these lockdowns had. But they don't care. They don't care. It's just like, okay, maybe that was a mistake, but let's move on. Let's move on. I mean, who cares, right? It's only half the small businesses, and it's only irreparable damage to young people. It's like it's a normal Tuesday.
Yeah, and there was a really good article about this in Reason Magazine, I think actually back last spring, where they were looking at some research that had been done by, I think, the University of Chicago and then maybe like King's College in London, if I remember correctly. But they were saying that the people that were the most comfortable with the lockdowns and the mask mandates and the vaccine mandates were people that had a nice home, that were able to continue to get a paycheck throughout the pandemic, and that didn't really bear any of the burdens, whereas the people that were extremely angry were the ones, obviously, whose lives it hurt. And there were a lot of people that switched from being kind of progressive or liberal into more conservative territory because of the government overreach that they saw. And obviously, like you said, it's just
the middle class tax cow in the flyover states. But nobody cares about them, right?
Yeah. Why do you think, I mean, and now, like with all of the evidence that we have coming out about how the vaccine, like, I remember a year ago, we were all, I'm a teacher and I work at a government school, which I know there's all kinds of problems with that. But like a year ago, we were forcing kids to mask up, and everyone that had a temperature that was above 97.6 had to take a test, and we were keeping kids out of school for 10 days. If they, we had all of these crazy policies, and it just like wrecked people's lives. And yet there are just so many people that just want to let that go, like it never happened.
Let bygones be bygones.
Yeah. What do you think? So it's very easy for like libertarians like us to look at people like Anthony Fauci, who I think we would both agree that he's a criminal, and he obviously knew that he was misleading the American people, and he was kind of the public face of the federal government's COVID response, and yet he's able to walk into the sunset with a bunch of checks from Pfizer and Moderna and absolutely no consequences for him being wrong all the way through. What do you think the proper accountability would be for people like Anthony Fauci and organizations like the NIH and the CDC that were largely responsible for destroying the lives of millions of people?
I think investigations need to be launched into the underhanded dealings between these organizations and these individuals, particularly in relation to the vaccine. Obviously, people have different perspectives on the vaccine. I won't try to make any arguments there. I will say that these companies are completely immune from any accountability. And I do know that obviously politicians, obviously public figures and organizations get a lot of kickback off of these kind of things, these unregulated practices. It's funny how the government will regulate every aspect of the market except whenever it comes to something that they can really make bank off of, right? And then all of a sudden they're free market capitalists. No, we don't want any accountability for vaccine makers. I mean, who cares, right? We have the FDA for that. or the CDC. So the regulation is just, I mean, you would think that there would be investigations launched, not even if there's anything there, just to make sure there isn't, but there isn't. Like nobody cares. And then 70 years later, you find out when everybody's already dead that, yeah, there was something there. So I think it's ridiculous that the government will try to regulate every aspect of the market except the aspects of the market that really matter and really impact people's lives. Um, as far as accountability is concerned, I mean, I think that the people that knowingly propagated this lockdown propaganda and, without any regard for the consequences that it might cause, I firmly believe these people are guilty of crimes against humanity. And I think that there's a proper punishment for that, which I will not say on the air.
Right. Well, I kind of wanted to. I want to talk about Ukraine a little bit too. I think we've kind of summarized where we're
Big
at
topic,
with COVID.
big topic.
Yeah, it is, and I a part of me, and it's kind of like what you were alluding to earlier. It's the fact that these politicians create systems that more or less completely absolve them from any responsibility for the
Yes.
harms that their policies cause to the average person. And it's very easy for me to see that, like, the Biden administration declared the pandemic was over in March of last year, right as we were ramping up full engagement with Ukraine. And it was almost as if, like, in lockstep, the mainstream media just pivoted from nonstop COVID
It was the new.
coverage for
It was
2
the new
years.
current thing. It was the new current thing.
Right.
Went from COVID to Ukraine.
Do you think that COVID was a part of that calculus? Like, do you think that one of the reasons why Ukraine became such a big story as early as it did was because there was I'm not like a conspiracy theorist, like, not that there was a concerted attempt, but it was like, oh, there was some bad stuff going on with COVID and we need to pivot to something different.
Yeah, I believe there was absolutely a pivot there. And as far as Ukraine's concerned, I mean, I can address that briefly, just a little bit.
Yeah.
I think that one of the things that's important to note is that obviously it's a complex issue, but the Russian invasion of Ukraine, it's not a spontaneous event. Okay, it is not spontaneous. It was the result of years of escalating tensions between Russia and Ukraine. And I believe, this is my personal opinion, I don't know where you stand on this, but I think that it was the result of the U.S. government's repeated attempts to interfere in the internal affairs of Ukraine. Our government, through its support of the Ukrainian government and its overly aggressive stance toward Russia, I think they created a climate of fear and mistrust, and I think that ultimately led to the pot boiling over, so to speak, by providing military aid to Ukraine, by constantly propping up the Ukrainian government. The U.S. government was inviting Russian aggression. And it's no surprise that Russia responded the way it did. I think that our government's continued efforts to interfere in Ukraine's internal affairs, what we're doing now is sending billions of dollars, not even to mention what we did beforehand through the funding of opposition groups and the promotion of anti-Russian propaganda. I think it only served to further escalate the tensions between the two countries. And the U.S. government's actions, as usual, were reckless, and they had predictable consequences. I think that the consequences of what the United States did was predictable, completely predictable. And Scott Horton has a new book coming out on that, which I'm very anxious to read. That really gets into the logistics of what caused the Russian invasion and the real factors behind the Russian invasion of Ukraine.
Yeah, and I had Benjamin Abelow on my show last week, and he's the author of a really great short introduction to the war in Ukraine called How the West Brought War to Ukraine. And he basically makes the same argument that you do, that after the Cold War, NATO and the United States continued to push and expand NATO further and further east, right up to Russia's borders, and then engaged in deliberate...
There was the U.S.-backed ouster of the Ukrainian president. Was it 2014? Yeah. That was a key turning point in escalating tensions between Russia and Ukraine. And I don't think that's one that can be ignored. I mean, the U.S.-backed ouster of the Ukrainian president, I think it was a clear violation of the principles of national sovereignty, obviously. And it set the stage for further conflict and instability. So these are all things that are going to be coming out pretty soon in Scott Horton's new book. And I'll leave him to make those arguments. But I think there is a lot more to this than meets the eye. It's not just Russia randomly wanted to invade Ukraine. There are so many logistics that go into this. And I think I would just say that it's unacceptable that the U.S. government interferes in the internal affairs of other countries the way that we do. Like, we have our grimy hands all over every country in everybody's business all around the world. And that is, I mean, it's just another clear example of the dangers of American imperialism. And whether you like it or not, U.S. foreign policy and the foreign policy of the American empire, which is an empire, not a republic, by the way, is imperialist. And some people don't like that term, but there is no other word for it. It is imperialist.
Yeah.
We have an imperialistic foreign policy.
Yeah, you're absolutely correct. And really, since the end of World War II, or you might even be able to push it back to Woodrow Wilson.
You might
at the
be
end
able
of
to
World
push
War
it back
I,
further.
really. Yeah, we've definitely been kind of the imperial power globally. Speaking,
Yes.
What's crazy to me about the war in Ukraine is that what happened with the war on terror is basically the exact same thing that happened with the run up to the war in Ukraine, where we had been, like you said, unnecessarily involved in Middle Eastern politics
And
for many, many years.
It's not just that. It's not just that. There's an article I read in Responsible Statecraft that talks about how I think there's like 10 major defense contractors. They have had record orders of equipment since the Ukrainian aid started. Now, after we got out of Afghanistan finally and replaced the Taliban with the Taliban, wasted billions of dollars to do that, we started sending all these weapons to Ukraine, and that became the new defense contractor push for equipment, right? So these contractors, I think Ukraine and the Ukrainian aid is really filling the void that the defense contractors felt from the lack of equipment after the Afghanistan withdrawal.
Yeah, and that was a point that, like, Thomas Massey, my congressman, had made before. The amount of money that we've spent on that we spent on Ukraine in 2022 was suspiciously similar to our annual spending in Afghanistan beforehand. So how do you see that working? So why is it that the defense contractors have such a sway and such a hold over our politicians in Washington?
First of all, let me just say the fact that you can vote for Thomas Massey makes me so jealous of you. You don't
It's
even
great,
know.
man. And Rand Paul too.
Yeah, and Rand Paul too, exactly. But defense contractors, the relationship between defense contractors and politicians has been something that has been happening for a very, very, very long time. Defense contractors need to build weapons, and if they're it's basic supply and demand. It's basic supply and demand. If the demand for weapons is not very high, then what is the need in having a supply? So, in order to make the demand of weapons high, you have to have a conflict that requires weapons. And you have all these deals that are made between politicians and defense contractors where they get cuts, they invest in defense stocks. I would pay good money to see these stock investments of Lindsey Graham, of Kevin McCarthy, of all these neocon politicians that are, obsessively pro-war and pro-intervention. Like, I bet they've got so much stock in Raytheon and, all these other defense contractors like Boeing and Northrop Grumman. I bet the investments there are crazy, and the kickbacks that they get off this are crazy. So yeah, that relationship has been there for a very long time. Eisenhower, I believe, was the first to talk about it. He coined the term military-industrial complex, and it had been happening long before then, obviously. I know Smedley Butler talked about in his book, War is a Racket, about how it was happening all in World War II and how it happened even before then. I think it's been happening for a very long time, but it's only relatively recently been brought to the forefront.
Yeah, and I think that the obvious failures of the war on terror has led to that for many Americans. Because again, if you look at the war on terror, we did not make the world a safer place. Like you said, we replaced the Taliban with the Taliban in Afghanistan. By all estimated accounts, because of a U.S. direct intervention, this doesn't count the famines and supply chains. But we killed we were responsible for the death of close to 2 million people in the Middle East over the last 20 years, and we have nothing to show for it except for 7,000 dead troops, and a bunch of troops that come home and commit suicide. We've got nothing from this. And so it's just amazing to me that the American public, you lived your entire life during the war on terror. And for me, it started when I was in 7th grade. So all of my adult life, we've been fighting in the Middle East. And it's there are so many people that have,
it is crazy that young people, that 18, 19, 20-year-olds are joining the military and going over and fighting in the same war that their father fought in. Like,
Yeah.
no war should last long enough that 2 generations get to fight in it. That is insane. And the only thing that's keeping these wars going is the military-industrial complex. And not just that, there's a lot of other dealings with the U.S. government in the Middle East, and there are a lot of other underlying reasons for keeping these wars going. And yeah, I think, just getting back to the point with Ukraine, I think that absolutely the Ukrainian aid, and so-called aid, all the money that we're spending on Ukraine from weapons and equipment is really filling that void that was created when we left Afghanistan. I don't think that's deniable. I think you look at the statistics, you look at the record profits that defense contractors are raking in. I mean, look at those profits. Look at those record sales of weapons and equipment, and tell me there's not a military-industrial complex. Come on.
Right. Right. In a time of great recession, too. It's like you look at Raytheon stock and they're posting like double-digit stock gains when every other company.
All the progressives want to talk about how all these corporations are raking in record profits in a time of recession. I would love for you to look at defense corporations, because I can tell you that whatever profit oil companies are raking in is a drop in the bucket compared to what they're raking in.
Yeah. Well, here's the really messed up thing about this war, too. And this is a point that Scott Horton makes a lot. But like, this isn't like the war in Ukraine it's not like fighting the Taliban. They did not have nuclear weapons. The people that died were low profile. The media did not pay much attention either to American casualties or to the thousands and thousands of Afghanistan casualties that took place every single year. With Ukraine, it's not like that. Like, we are in a proxy war with a country that has nuclear missiles, that is industrialized, and that does not want to give up. So like, why do you think is it really just like that kind of the greed of these defense companies that's pushing us closer and closer to nuclear war? Like, this is a real possibility. Like more so than at any point in my life, we are living with the threat of a nuclear war with Russia, because we continue to push in this war that we shouldn't be involved in anyways. Like, our policymakers have to understand that. Is it just greed, or is it government incompetence? Like, how do you account for just how irrational what is happening in Ukraine is right now?
It's a combination of both. It's obviously the greed of politicians, the greed of defense contractors, and it's also just general incompetence and not really caring about the consequences of actions and taking them anyhow, which is something that the government wrote the book on taking actions and being unaccountable for actions. So yeah, I think that the government incompetence definitely factors in. Greed factors in. There are a lot of factors, and you have to remember that all these different wars and all these different conflicts, we can put arbitrary standards on them, but there are different standards and different circumstances that go into all these conflicts. There are different reasons that the U.S. government wants to be there. There are different reasons that defense contractors want to produce weapons for a certain country. There are all kinds of reasons. So, I mean, it is greed, it is incompetence, but it's also a million other factors.
Yeah. Well, and it's just crazy to me that we continue to accept, and not that you and I as individuals have a choice, but that we as a society continue to accept this state of affairs. When I had Ablo on the show last week, I asked him kind of my final question, how he thought the war in Ukraine was going to wind up. And he did not give me a very reassuring answer. He basically thinks that more than likely, if it doesn't end in a nuclear war, it's something catastrophic is going to happen in order for the war to come to some sort of resolution. What are your views on that?
Scenario, I mean, do you see best case scenario, it ends in an armistice. Worst case scenario, we end up in a nuclear war with Russia. So those are your choices, and choose wisely, because, well, you're not making the choice. The government will make the choice for you. Depending on what the U.S. government does, you will suffer the consequences. If the U.S. government gets into a nuclear war, the citizenry will suffer the consequences while the government hides in a bunker. That is classic government right there.
Yeah, and this is what's really frustrating to me, is that I have no problem with anyone personally in Russia or Ukraine or Canada or China or anywhere around the world. And the fact that millions and millions and millions of us could die because of this conflict that is basically being brought along by the global elites, to me, it's just completely insane that we have to live with this threat of government stupidity forcing millions and millions of innocent people that have no problems with each other into a position where we might all die because of a nuclear war. It just doesn't make any sense to me at all.
Or have to kill each other in a shooting war, assuming it doesn't become nuclear. It's insane. It is insane. And I think it also brings up an important point that governments don't just stop at demonizing militaries and leaders. When two governments fight each other, like if the United States went to war with China, we would not be at war based on propaganda, based on the narrative in the United States. We would not be at war with the Chinese government. We would not be at war with the Chinese Communist Party. We would be at war with the Chinese. So we would be at war with the citizenry. We would have beef with all Chinese. We wouldn't just have beef with the government. And this is something that has happened in the last several decades, is that instead of being at war with governments and being at war with militaries, we have demonized entire populations. Everybody want to talk about the Russians, the Chinese, the North Koreans. Those people haven't done anything to us. In many ways, they're just like you and me. So, no, it is not okay to demonize entire populations. And we've seen the effect of these kind of things. The demonization of German Americans during World War I, the demonization, and I might add incarceration of Japanese Americans in World War II. So, no, it is not okay to paint with a broad brush and to demonize populations and not just governments. Wars should be between governments. To the extent that wars happen at all, it should happen between governments. And I tend to think it should happen between leaders. Like we should just have a free for all. All the leaders should just fight it out, and nobody else has to get killed. But that's just my own estimation. But I think that we should not demonize entire populations. We should not say the Chinese, the Russians, the North Koreans, because this is dehumanizing. This is dehumanizing an entire population, and it is really, really, really something that we don't need to be doing. And we've seen the effects of it, and we've seen what this does. And I fear that Russian immigrants and people of Russian descent, if the U.S. were to go to war with Russia, you would see hate crimes against people of Russian descent. If the U.S. were to go to war with China, you would see, if you think you have a rise in anti-Asian hate now, wait till the United States goes to war with China. Because governments demonize entire populations. They don't just demonize the government they're fighting or the military they're fighting. And that leads to racism and a host of other issues.
Yeah, and it's that same kind of collectivist thinking that always leads to pain and suffering around the globe. That's why we have to be individualists and treat everyone on an individual basis. It's like the fundamental principle of libertarianism, and our leaders just seem completely incapable of grasping that. But there was recently, the last time I had you on the show, it was before the midterm elections. And at that time, they were predicting that there was going to be a red wave, that the Republicans were going to take the House and take the Senate. And that turned out to not be the case at all. They did take control of the House. It's a slim majority in the House of Representatives. And there were a lot of, when the Republicans were, I guess, elected in to the House of Representatives, there were several Republicans that made big promises about Ukraine and about, COVID trials and things like that. Do you think that the Republican control of the House is going to change anything at all, or is it just going to be business as usual as Washington for the time being?
Absolutely not. Business as usual. The dog and pony show that is national politics. Oh, I could talk about that for hours. I mean, right? It's no secret that the two major parties, they're two sides of the same status coin, whether they want to admit it or not. And they both believe in a strong central government, and they both believe that the state has the right to dictate how individuals should live their lives. And I think it's important that we reject these notions, obviously, as individualists, and instead support only candidates that align with our views. And that means supporting candidates who believe in individual sovereignty, limited government, personal responsibility. It's important that we don't support either of the major parties. Like, don't support the party. Don't support the party as a corporation. Don't support the party as an entity. Don't do it monetarily or otherwise. That's because both parties are, beholden to special interests. They're beholden to corporate donors. The Republican Party, in particular, has this thing where they really hate their base. The Democratic Party loves their base, and they try to do what their base wants. But the Republican Party, they really hate their base. They will do the exact opposite of what the base says, just for the heck of it. So I think, but just, to finish up with that point, I think by supporting specific candidates that align with our views, who work to create a more free and just society, we can reject the dog and pony show that is national politics, and we can instead support candidates who actually support liberty. But to answer your question, no, nothing is going to change. Republicans and Democrats, except for a few notable exceptions, which you know who I'm talking about, they are no different from the other, except one is on one extreme and one is on the other extreme. And it is just really a never-ending dog and pony show. It's like professional wrestling. It's theater, plain and
Yeah.
simple.
Yeah. Well, I know, and really, I think both of these parties, they just represent the self-styled elites of the
Yes.
American civilization. And these people they genuinely do think that they are better and smarter than the rest of us and more capable of
Yes.
managing every aspect of our lives. Another group that I wanted to ask you about that has only really recently come on my radar is the World Economic Forum. I'm reading through Michael Rechtenwald, has a really
Oh
great book
wow.
right now called The Great Reset, where he talks about
Mhm.
kind of the agenda of the World Economic Forum, and it's essentially this committee of politicians and business leaders and celebrities from all around the world, and they meet in Davos, Switzerland once a year, and they are creating plans to try to push the future of the globe in a certain direction. I wonder if you've done any research on the World Economic Forum, if you have any thoughts on what they're doing, because it's becoming more and more apparent to me that that might be the greatest source of evil in the entire world right now. So I don't know if you know much about that. I just kind of wanted to get your perspective on it.
I've done a little bit of research on the World Economic Forum, and from what little research I've done, I think that realistically, it may be the greatest threat to liberty that we face in the next 10 years. The Great Reset, for people that don't know what that is, it's a global initiative, basically. It's global. It's not focused on one country or another. It's global. It seeks to fundamentally transform the way that we live, the way that we work, the way that we interact with each other, fundamentally transform human existence. And I know a lot of misguided individuals out there are going to say, well, maybe that's progress. But the reality is that the Great Reset is being driven by global elitists. They're elites. They believe in a strong central government. They believe in the absolute power of the state. And I think this agenda represents a threat to our individual liberty and freedom, the likes of which we haven't seen in a while. I guess one of the biggest issues with the Great Reset is the hypocrisy, right? The global elites that are promoting it. Individuals that chastise normal citizens for their carbon footprint while they themselves travel by private jet, emitting more carbon into the atmosphere than any normal citizen in their car could ever hope to. So it's that kind of double standard that, let's see, what's the word I'm looking for here? It's a hallmark. It's a hallmark of the global elite, and it's unacceptable. We have to reject things like the Great Reset. Um, we have to reject these kind of top-down collectivist solutions, and we have to work toward a future that's based on freedom and not top-down control by a small conglomerate of global elites that want to decide what you eat, what you drink, and what you do in general. Just decide your life for you and control every aspect of your life. We have to reject that.
Yeah, and that's what I think most Americans, most moderates, and then obviously conservatives too. I think people are, like you said before, with COVID and with the wars and everything like that. They're starting to realize that there are some deep problems with our federal government, and now really might be kind of like a golden age of suspicion towards centralized power. And I completely agree. I think that if you have problems with the way that our federal government is run, and with the size and scope of our federal government, and with the intrusions that the federal government has made in every aspect of our private lives, the World Economic Forum is like that, except for the entire world. And so, like, all of the
Yep.
libertarian critiques of the federal government would apply to them. And I think, too, like, there are a lot of people that have been trained by or been part of the World Economic Forum in countries like Canada and New Zealand, where they had the most stringent lockdown measures. And we can kind of see what they've already done to their citizenry as kind of like an advanced screening of what the World Economic Forum would do to the rest of us if they were given that kind of power. So this is a very scary thing to think that there are these organizations out there that want to continue to centralize power and take away our liberties. It's just not a good prospect for freedom.
Absolutely. It's not a good
Yeah.
prospect at all.
But there's another thing, kind of segueing a little bit. I know you addressed it a little bit in your episode with Tom Woods, and we talked about it very briefly on the show the last time you were on here. But I wanted to talk about the connection that you have made between your faith as a Christian and libertarianism. Because again, as the more and more I dive into Austrian economics and libertarian philosophy, the more and more I think that it can really be the only compatible political philosophy with true Christian values. How do you draw that connection between your Christian faith and libertarianism?
So, in my conversation with Tom Woods, we explored the kind of the intersectionality in more detail uh, than we did the last time I was on your show. And I think that it's a very important conversation. It's an important conversation that is not being had enough in the public discourse. And too often people are told that they have to choose between their faith and their political beliefs or their ideology. But I think that's the wrong way to think. I think that, well, it's my hope this is more and more people begin to understand the compatibility between faith and libertarianism, that we'll see a growing movement of people who are guided both by their religious convictions and by their beliefs. I don't think that there's a choice there. I mean, libertarianism is all about individual liberty, freedom. And in many ways, I think it aligns with the teachings of Christianity. And in particular, there's this belief in personal responsibility, that there's a great intersectionality here. And the importance of living a virtuous life, they're common to, many faith traditions, and those beliefs are central to libertarianism as well. And I just think that if I had to choose, I don't like to draw conclusions between ideology and faith, because I just don't think that is, the right way to go. I don't think that's proper, proper behavior. But I will say that if I had to choose an ideology that is closest to Christian teaching in the way that the ideology is and in the principles of the ideology, I would have to say that it's libertarianism, because it has a very big emphasis on personal responsibility and taking responsibility for your actions. And it also has a very big emphasis on people being allowed to do what they want to do, but there could be consequences afterward, but still being free to do what you want to do. And I think that Christianity and libertarianism has an intersectionality, but I don't want to, say that libertarianism is a Christian ideology or draw a conclusion between the two, because I just don't think that's right. But I think there's an intersectionality there that isn't talked about enough, for sure.
Yeah. So I don't know if you've done this or whatever, but have you ever had any pushback from other Christians when you talk to them about libertarianism?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah, talk to us about that. What are the usual counter arguments that people offer?
The usual counter arguments?
Yeah.
Romans 13, the verse in Matthew that talks about render unto Caesar. A few Bible verses that are pretty clear. But I think that it's absolutely important to understand context. Context is important. When people talk about biblical text, when people talk about the Bible and discuss the scriptures, I think often context is completely thrown to the wind, right? Um, and I think that's the case with render unto Caesar. I mean, I made the point on Tom Wood's show that everybody is going to draw their own conclusions about those kind of verses. And the conclusion that I have drawn through studying that verse and also studying the context is number one, I believe that it is a brilliant answer to a question that was specifically designed to entrap Jesus. I believe it's a brilliant answer. I think it's a brilliant answer, and I think that the design of the question was designed to entrap him. Because if he said that the Jews should pay their taxes, the Jews would turn against him. If he said the Jews should not pay their taxes, the Jews would tell the Romans, and the Romans would come against him. So it was kind of a catch-22. So I believe that the answer that was given was very cryptic. Some people will say it was clear. I don't think it's clear. I think it's cryptic, because to render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and I think if we approach this from the perspective that God is the author and owner of everything, and essentially the human race is God's property of sorts, and we are owned by God, I believe that we can draw the conclusion that that answer is not as clear as you might think. Because if we render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's, and we approach this from a Christian worldview, which obviously people who make this argument are, we have to take into account that Caesar owns nothing, because God owns Caesar. So if God owns Caesar, Caesar owns nothing, because everything that is Caesar's is God's. If we render unto Caesar that which is Caesar, we render him nothing. So I think that there is absolutely another way to look at that. And I know that these kind of arguments can often get into the weeds. And I know that a lot of theologians and a lot of thinkers have particularly tried to wrestle these verses. And I'm not going to get into that because I'm not an intellectual, and I have way better things to do than to try to argue about what one thing or another actually means. Like, I understand that everybody's going to draw their own conclusion, but I don't believe that libertarianism and Christianity are incompatible based on those verses. And also, briefly, because this is another thing that gets brought up, submit to the governing authorities. Well, most Christians will say, well, does this mean that you should submit to, I don't know, Mao? Does it mean that you should submit to Stalin? Does it mean you should submit to Hitler? And you have to take things to the extremes to really draw the proper conclusions, right? And I think that most Christians would say, well, if the government's not being godly and not following God's commandments and God's teachings, that we don't have to, if it runs contrary to our faith, then we don't have to follow it. That's always the escape hatch. And I would just say that if you are basing whether or not you follow your government on whether or not your government is moral, welcome to libertarianism.
Right. Yep, that's absolutely correct. And even then, in that passage in Romans chapter 13:1, I have an episode that I've recorded, but I haven't released yet on this. And the form of the verb submit that Paul uses in Romans 13 is a passive form. And so in the rest of the, whenever Paul uses the verb submit and throughout the New Testament, it's active. So like when it comes to like Christians submitting to one another, it's something that you're supposed to like willingly do. It's something that you're supposed to do with positive attitude. But when he talks about submitting to the government, the verb is used in the passive form. It's like, well, you just kind of have to accept that these are the people that are in power. We're not going to pick up a sword and go and fight against them. You just have to submit like that. And so I think that even like there are a lot of really interesting, to your point, like technical distinctions in the text that don't just say we have to accept this massive government and their massive government overreaches if we want to be faithful to the Bible. So I think that was a really great summary there. Personally, you have a lot of great things going on in your life. So there's this magazine starting up called the Mises Magazine, and you have a pretty large role in that. So maybe talk about the Mises Magazine and the role that you're going to play.
So the Mises Magazine, or Mises Magazine, kind of came about as a pet project of the Liberty Youth Coalition. If you don't know what that is, it's a rising organization that is really trying to get a foothold. We are a rising organization, and we kind of stemmed from misdirection at Young Americans for Liberty, which I won't get into, but I'm sure you're aware of. And then there was a pet project of the CEO and others that related to misdirection at Reason, which obviously is the premier libertarian magazine publication that everybody uses. And there were a lot of articles that were being printed that had a lot of libertarians asking, why would you even print this? So we thought, and particularly the CEO and some others thought, it would be nice if we had a publication that was, actually committed to the principles of liberty and not just, 90% of the time or 80% of the time, but 100% of the time. And so Mises Magazine was born, obviously named after Ludwig von Mises, who is a household name for anyone who knows about and follows Austrian economics. Great guy, lived to a very old age, had some very great writings, and a very great, I think he had a great philosophy. So obviously we named it after Mises. And because that's where everybody goes, right? Mises Caucus, Mises Institute, Mises Magazine. Everybody loves Mises. So we named it after Mises. And this is a publication that is really going to be dedicated to liberty, but not just dedicated to liberty. We want to have debates. We want to have debates in this publication. We want to open up the pages to this magazine for debate between conservatives and libertarians, for a debate between anarchists and libertarians. We want to have open debate because I think it is important to have open debate. And this is something that we've talked about. We want to have debates in the pages of the magazine. And, we're not really sure what that looks like yet because obviously we're in the early stages. But we want to have free and open debate. I don't think this is something that a lot of other magazines, particularly in the libertarian sphere, do, but I think it's important to not have an echo chamber and to have debates. If someone writes a ridiculous article about how government is moral and we should all follow government no matter where it leads, I'm not going to publish that alone in the magazine because that does not align with the mission statement of the organization and the magazine itself. But if I can have someone write a rebuttal to that, then yes, I will publish it, and we will have those debates. And I think that it's important to have debates, and I believe that Mises Magazine is going to be a big thing. I think it's the future of the libertarian magazine world, because I mean we have writers that have come on. We have writers that have come on as recurring writers. So we're going to have a good collection of writers. We're going to have a great collection of articles, and it's a big thing. And I've taken the role as chief editor, making sure that everything that goes into the magazine is proper, and making sure that stuff that's not proper stays out of the magazine. And really, I've taken on a role more as director of the magazine. Like, just basically, it's my project now, and I have a team, that a very great team that is helping me out, and we hope to have it out by the summer. We hope to do that, but websites and website hosting services can be a pain. So it will depend, but we hope to have it out by the summer. I do not have a link as of yet, but we hope to have a link soon. We hope to have that website up, and we hope to have it running. And we hope to have it out for the summer.
Yeah, that sounds great. Well, you mentioned that you work with the Liberty Youth Coalition, and I'll give you had a very brief description of it a second ago, but maybe if you could give us a little bit more of an extensive explanation. What is the Liberty Youth Coalition, and what is your role in that?
So the Liberty Youth Coalition is it's an organization that kind of sprung up out of the ashes of the misdirection at the top. Not at the bottom, not the activists, at the top, but the leadership of Young Americans for Liberty. A lot of people were fired. A lot of people had to go because there was a different direction entirely for the people that were at the top. So some of the people that worked for Young Americans for Liberty decided to start a new organization that would be Young Americans for Liberty, but actually libertarian. So and would have good leadership that would be able to take it in all the right directions. So Emmanuel Ruiz, who is our CEO and previously worked for Young Americans for Liberty, started the Liberty Youth Coalition. And we have a set of principles that we're dedicated to. One of them that I think is particularly important to mention is mutual aid, because this is something that I don't see a lot of libertarian organizations do. And I think this is important. I do not in any way subscribe to Ayn Rand's objectivist idea that charity is evil. I don't believe that altruism is evil. I don't believe that charity is evil. I believe if we really believe in personal responsibility, we really believe in that individualistic libertarian message, that we should be committed to mutual aid. And that means charity work. That means getting out into our communities and reaching out and helping people. And that's something that our organization is committed to as well, and not just on paper. This is something that we actually do.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, it's good to have organizations like that, and I think that's a really great movement. Before I let you go here, we got just a few more minutes left. I wanted to talk about the future of the country real quick, just kind of a way of summing all this stuff up. So, what do you think about the current state? We touched on it a little bit before, and we said that both the Republicans and the Democrats are obviously big government, anti-liberty parties, and that we shouldn't support them. What do you think about the current and future state of the Republican and Democratic Party? Do you think that there's hope that either of these parties will reform and maybe start going in a more liberty-oriented direction? Or do you think maybe the opposite, that they're both going to become more authoritarian? Where do you see the direction of those parties?
I would just say this. The Democratic Party has no reason to go in a liberty-oriented direction, but if the Republican Party does not go in a liberty-oriented direction within the next 20 years, they will cease to exist. The Republican Party has to become, at least to the extent that they are now, which is none, they have to be more libertarian. Because if they want to bring in younger people and they want to actually have younger people vote for them, you can't have all these top-down authoritarian stances. You have to be, to some extent at least, libertarian. And I think that the Republican Party will eventually realize, and they'll become some kind of a conservatarian hybrid, and there will be a few libertarians in the party and a few non-libertarians, and they'll battle it out and all that. But overall, your question is about the direction, basically, of the country, correct?
Yeah.
Like within 2024 and beyond. And I think a lot of people are pessimistic about the state of the country, but I can say that I'm cautiously optimistic. I think that, the reason for my optimism is that I believe that the principles of libertarianism are becoming increasingly popular among the American people, particularly after COVID and the authoritarianism that we saw there. Young people in particular are beginning to reject the old ideas of big government, and they're instead embracing the ideals of individual liberty and at least limited government, which is a work in progress, but they'll get there. Now, there will always be those who believe in a strong central government. There will always be those that believe in the top-down absolute power of the state. And I believe that as more and more people embrace the principles of libertarianism, we will see a shift toward a more free and just society. And in the upcoming election in 2024, I would just say this. I think it's important for libertarians to support candidates that align with their views. I'll repeat what I said before. And I think by doing so, we can help to ensure that the future of our country is one of freedom and liberty and not authoritarianism. So I'm cautiously optimistic. I think that the principles of libertarianism are gaining popularity, and I think we've worked to create a more free and just society. It's going to be work. It's not going to be easy. It will be work, but by supporting candidates that align with our views, particularly in the next election, and by trying to gain a little bit of control, whatever that looks like, I think we can begin to see a shift. You don't have to have a majority of the Republican Party. You don't have to have a majority of any party be anything. People are always going to have their ideology. People are always going to be different. But if libertarians can get a hold of, if libertarians can make up 15% of the Republican voter base, then Republicans have to start taking notice.
Yeah. So we'll end up today with the 2024 election. Where does the Republican field stand right now? I know that there's kind of been a rift between Trump and DeSantis over the last couple. I guess really it's not been a rift between them. It's been Trump attacking DeSantis and DeSantis not responding. Who do you think is going to emerge as the potential Republican nominee? Do you think the Democrats are going to run Joe Biden, or is he even going to survive until 2024? Who do you think the showdown is going to be between the two parties?
I really don't know. I think that if the Republicans aren't careful, this in-party fighting is going to cause them to lose the next election. Because if you have a very ugly primary, say DeSantis throws his hat in the ring, you have a very ugly primary between DeSantis and Trump, and there's a lot of bad blood there and hard feelings, then you're going to see low turnout on the Republican end, because the Trump supporters are going to say, well, I'm not going to support DeSantis. Look how ugly that primary was. And the DeSantis supporters are going to say, well, I'm not going to support Trump because look how ugly Trump was in that primary season. So they have to be careful. There are other people that have thrown their hat in the ring. There's Nikki Haley, who is your typical extremely pro-war, but don't worry, I'm pro-limited government conservative, which is and she's an old guard Bush conservative. I like to call her Jeb Bush in drag. I think that's beautiful. That's an accurate description. Baroness of foreign warfare, war queen of the South. I have a lot of different little nicknames for her. But yeah, overall, I think that the Republican Party, the Democratic Party, they'll have to figure it out in the primary cycle, and obviously it'll be ugly. I think that Trump probably, as much as some people might hate it, probably has the best chance at this point. A lot of people think DeSantis could give him a run for his money in a primary. I don't know if that's the case. I don't even know if DeSantis will jump in. Maybe he will, maybe he won't. But if it's Trump and it's Biden, if I had to flip a coin, if I were a betting man, I would say Biden wins re-election.
Yeah,
that would just be my. I mean, maybe Trump pulls it out, but it would be very close. But I think Biden would win.
Yeah, it's a depressing thought. I'll give you one more here right before we wrap up. Then, too, just to kind of extend from that conversation, who do you think the Libertarians are going to run?
Dave Smith.
You all right? So you really do think that he's gonna go for it?
Yes, and I think that this is something that's also important because if we could get a libertarian on the debate stage, we can start to see. Obviously, a libertarian's not going to win the presidency. I mean, that's pretty much a given at this point. But if we can get a libertarian on the debate stage to actually propagate all the right ideas and to talk to the people and talk directly to the audience, I think that's something we've been missing for a long time, and that's something that we definitely need. And Dave Smith is that guy that can relate to the common man and can really talk into the camera and talk to the audience and propagate all the right ideas. So yeah, I would absolutely support him if he ran for president.
Yeah, I completely agree. And man, wouldn't it be great to see him on the debate stage against Trump and Biden? That would be incredible. That'd be incredible. Well, Ezra, this has been a great conversation. I really appreciate you coming on the show today. Where can people find you
Absolutely.
and your work?
You can follow me on Twitter at Ezra for Liberty. I also have a Substack, which is Ezra's newsletter. You can just type it into the search bar; it should come up. And also, you can follow the Liberty Youth Coalition at libertylyceum.com. But that is a website that we're using right now. We're going to have another website, as I mentioned, that will be up hopefully this month. So we will have another link. But for right now, it's libertylyceum.com. And if you would like to donate to our cause and you'd like to donate to our founding, then you can do so at www.givesendgo.com/sparkliberty.
All right, perfect. And I'll put the links to all of that stuff in the show notes there. Ezra, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Thanks for listening to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. If you have any questions or comments or thoughts about the show, please reach out to me at theprotestantlibertarian@gmail.com. You can also follow me on Twitter at ProLibertyPod. Again, you can follow me on Twitter at ProLibertyPod. You can also support the show by leaving a rating or a review on your favorite podcast app. Thank you guys so much for listening, and we'll see you next week.